America, kind of encountered them, some of the families, Salvadorian refugees, Guatemalan refugees, who actually I helped personally while I was directing the Jesuit Refugee Service in Central America, especially in Guatemala. I encountered them in Boston or in Rhode Island and Connecticut. And I came across of being invited by the director of the Peabody Museum at Harvard, Roxana Reddington. She's an anthropologist, and she invited me to give a lecture on the present Mayan history. And I went down there, and that lecture that I was having with a lot of anthropologists who spoke Spanish very well, who public health, they were using a new methodology of going into the communities, and they call it the methods of community primary oriented care, where doctors, nurses, and public health services providers, instead of waiting in their offices or clinics for the people to come, they have to learn how to go into the communities and map in the communities and actually go and do the service, inform the people and do more outreach. And I felt myself like that model, community primary oriented care, COPC, which is called, they had a long story about that model, which was created by the Navajo Indians from some doctors who were actually working at the reservation in the Navajo territory. I kind of related very well with that model because in Central America and Latin America we have the liberation theology model, action, reflection, and action about reflection, and reflection about action, which was basically the model that we were developing and organizing communities, or basically use the participatory way using popular education tools in order to have all the voices represented in any training, instead of being a lecture where you just give the knowledge. You actually take the knowledge from what the people know about any circumstances or any theoretical background in terms of experiences of how to resolve problems. I got very interested about how this community-oriented primary care was being implemented, and I kind of felt like when I was doing my work with the AIDS patients, a lot of Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, they were basically isolated. I noticed that it was very easy for me to implement my popular educational trainings, because the first thing that you learn from this methodology is to understand the structure of oppression. And immigrants with AIDS, they were oppressed, isolated, and they know very well how oppressed they are. And I thought, well, this is the same methodology. If somebody understands very well their oppression, it's easy for them to talk about the oppression circumstances and start thinking and reflecting about how to get free from that oppressive system. And I had some inputs from my trainings and working with the immigrants. I thought to myself that was a big need. That's why I decided to apply for my Latin American studies and went to San Diego State University, where actually in 1999 I met in the border of Tijuana and San Diego good friends, some former Jesuits, wonderful organizers who actually were in Central America and maybe in Chiapas, some of them. And I was surprised that when I went to San Diego, I met wonderful people that we used to work together in Central America, and we found ourselves to start working with the Interfaith Coalition for Immigrants' Rights, which was basically an interfaith religious-based organization, a volunteer organization that wanted to work with the immigrant people. And being in San Diego, to me, it was a great opportunity to know more about the immigrant stories. And those stories, to me, were very fresh, very new. Some of them just crosses the border a week previous to my encounter with them, some of them a month, and some of them were already well established. And I knew that there was a big need to actually provide the services for these newcomers, and also to talk to the people who already were there, and also talk to the Latino community and professionals who actually were already established. Some of them actually with a lot of desires to identify with the Latino involvement and Latino causes, issues, but losing a lot of contextual references. And I encountered a lot of leaders from the Chicano movement and people who wanted to help, but I noticed that some of the newcomers were kind of feeling not just betrayed, but also rejected by their own Latino brothers. And to me, that was a big sad thing, no? Because every time I was with having this contact with the professional, with the students at the university or in the social service sector, like I will say social workers, public health workers, employees from the probation department, workers, Latino workers who are basically serving in the industrial or maybe in the private sector. In general, they have a different images about these newcomers. No, they blame of the newcomers who are not driving with license, driver license. They are blaming on these newcomers taking over some jobs because they don't care about how much they can get paid. And the field work on the San Joaquin Valley or Fresno Valley in California or in San Diego Valley, in general, those dynamics I was learning that has been reproduced by different ethnical cultural groups throughout the history of the United States. I mean, I kind of share and I was informed myself that the cycles of these immigrants, and in the past 50 years, I will say from 1942 especially to 1962, in Mexico was implemented the Braceros policy, which was after or during the war, Second World War II. I mean, Second War, in the U.S. economy needed a lot of the Mexican labor force in order to actually keep the economy up, and that's the circumstances where the U.S. foreign policy decided to invite some Mexican people. I mean, a lot of Mexicans went from 1942 to 1962 under that program, and I was learning about that thing. The foreign policy was really very open to accept immigrants who wanted to come to support the economy. And by searching about this history background, I was sharing with the people in the professional sector with the Latinos, and I was telling them that it's very important to actually, if we were going to be, or if we are, I told them, no, in the U.S. context, the 11% of the population, the minority which was seen as the majority in the U.S., because 11% are Latino now and 10% are African American descendant. Some people get pride. They're very proud about being a big large of massive Latino leaders, but actually I was identifying that we have a lot of Latinos who drop out of school, the teenage pregnancy. I was looking around the drugs issue among the Latino families, and how being in San Diego State University and also very connected with the University of San Diego, California, UCSD, I noticed that I was one of those few Latinos who were at the master program level. I actually wanted to see more Latinos and see more Latinos at the university, but I actually didn't experience that. I saw a lot of Anglos, Asian people, especially from China and Japan and Korean. I had the majority of my classmates in Latin American studies were, they were basically Anglo, Saxon people, everyone white from the United States, interested in learning about Latin America. And my voice had to be represented there, and I actually wanted to get the people to understand a little bit about what's going on. I never felt like a specialist on Latin American studies, but sometimes I heard my professors talking about the Peruvian reality or the Bolivian reality. Some of them were talking about the Central American reality. And some of them were kind of, in my view, they were missing some points in the way they were interpreting the reality of Central America, which is something that I know well, because I could say that I know Central American by foot. I walk from Guatemala to Panama, literally walking. No? I did work for years in every country in Latin America, and all of a sudden I find Latin American specialists who actually were, maybe they were expert in militarism, or they were expert in the agrarian reform in certain countries in Latin America. And maybe that wasn't my specialty, but I knew that there were some missing points with the classes, the seminar classes was happening. And I noticed that to me it was very important to learn more about this, and because I wanted to share and to at least put more bibliography and more into a context, and not just having the theoretical background on that. And also sometimes the Latino immigrant population are misrepresented and misunderstood by the action, and I was kind of always trying to put in context, like making some statements that the Salvadorian campesino families who are living in Los Angeles, they never ask to be in Los Angeles, no? They never ask to be the Guatemalan community, they never were asked to be in Los Angeles. They actually didn't know where Los Angeles was. But the circumstances of the war in the 80s brought the people to the point that people had to flee, went across Mexico and ended up in the U.S. And of course the U.S. is always a dream. It has been a country where the immigrants through its history has been helping and adding. It's a wonderful country where the immigrant really have a place, and that history in combination, what it's called in the US the melted pot, is in a way a good example of multiculturalism. Although theoretically speaking people don't accept these concepts just by having cultures from all over, but just being in San Diego, I was in one site which is called El Cajon, and I was very amazed by how many groups live there, no? Like 52 groups from Middle Eastern, and everyone under the umbrella. I could see in San Diego areas a lot of people from Africa, from Ethiopia, Somalia, Eritrea, and people actually with Iraq, from Iraq, a lot of people from Belen, Palestinians, and Jewish also, and how everyone actually combined their lives in a social structured way, and how people actually live. And of course, all of these wonderful ways of being raised and exposed in a different cultural context, I always was thinking to myself how wonderful it was when I was growing up in Guatemala, having my my elementary school, some friends who were Maya Quiche descendants, Cachiqueles, Quechí, and Garifuna, and some of them from the islands, the Antilles Islands, from Montserrat, from Jamaica, from Trinidad and Tobago, from Belize, Honduras, just because it was the headquarters of the United States. And once in a while we had some friends from, especially from Turk. There were some Turkish workers also, even gypsies. No? I remember families who were typified when I was growing up, like gypsies from Romania. And of course I learned very late in my life, about this mixture of going back and forth, working with the Latino immigrants and working in the border settings. And I did a pilgrimage in 2002. It was a pilgrimage that I was one of the organizers too, among my friend Ed Dan, who was a religious guy. He just recently passed away. We were working in Central America, and he actually was the director of the Interfaith Coalition for Immigrants' Rights. And we decided to create a pilgrimage to learn more about the border and more about the immigrant, and some organized based groups from Texas, in the corner of Texas, in the eastern part. They got together, Brownsville, and we from San Diego, the end from Tijuana and San Diego, got together, and we decided to encounter together in El Paso, Texas, or Ciudad Juarez. And we did that pilgrimage, and we were visiting all the halls from where immigrants were crossing, and we heard testimonies from people who were just crossing while we were there, and their stories, their lives, their afraidness, and everything. And I thought to myself, well, it's not just Latinos from Mexico or Central or South America. It's not just people who are just from other countries. I actually identified myself when I was in the Tijuana and San Diego area in California, that those who were typified like Mexican people, actually the majority are Mixtec from Oaxaca, from the southern part of Mexico. And the Mixtec community don't feel themselves as Mexican. They feel themselves as Mixtecs, but they don't call in the US Mixtec or Mixtecos. Everyone call them Mexicans. And for them, being in Oaxaca and being from Oaxaca, and also knowing that whatever services they need in the US context, they always will find a Mexican fellow who will be there. And what is in the back in the head, in the dynamics that exist in Oaxaca between non-indigenous Latinos and Mixtec people. The Mixtec people are totally oppressed by the non-indigenous, the Latinos, and they kind of feel like those Mexicans who are in Oaxaca, who controls them, or that are racist against them, practices racism against them. They were the same dynamics that were existing in San Diego, and they didn't feel comfortable. But among the Mixtec, I identified some Zapotec indigenous too. And all of a sudden, I was learning that my friends from Guatemala, leaders from Los Angeles, who were from the Huehuetenango region, they actually had a community, Jacaltecos and Aguacatecos, in the San Diego County area. And I was visiting them, and I was knowing how the Guatemalan community were surviving the immigration police by just saying, we are Mixtec from Oaxaca, we are no Guatemalan. And it happened that I learned one story from a doctor friend of mine who actually belonged to the Interfaith Coalition for Immigrants' Rights. He and his wife, they told me the way they identify the Guatemalan community among their neighborhood, one of the wealthy neighborhoods in San Bernardo in San Diego, California. This doctor friend of mine was helping them, knowing because they have some Mixtec people who were working in their gardens. And as a gardeners, he always thought that the 2-3 guys who he was having in his house were from Oaxaca. But little by little he was learning that once in a while he was asked by the 2 gardeners that he had, please to read or write some letters for them to send it back to their home. And he always read in the letter Huehuetenango. He always thought that Huehuetenango was in Oaxaca. He never thought that those 2 were Guatemalans. Finally, in one of the letters, one of the brother of one of these gardeners, he was in an emergency, and he was talking about going back to Guatemala, and if he could have the job after he goes to Guatemala for a while. And he said, why are you going to Guatemala? Because I have to go and see my mother. Well, anyway, he said, why in Guatemala and not in Oaxaca, Mexico, no? And they confessed that they were Guatemalans. I think after that experience, he started to search around, and he called the people, how many Guatemalans do you think we have in this area? And the 2 guys told them, well, we have like thousands of Guatemalans living in those communities where the Mixtec gathers, no? Those skill survivors or survival skills, some things that I learned when I was in California. And I thought to myself, well, there are a lot of indigenous here. I've been helping in Central America a lot of indigenous causes. And how can we link the indigenous communities, immigrant indigenous, with that whole idea that we had when I was working among the Jesuits in Central America Indigenous Mission, to link them and to actually to form a network among the indigenous peoples. And that's the way we became with the whole idea to actually create the Nahual Foundation think tank formed by indigenous people of the Americas. And since I met some professors at the university, I thought that it would be wonderful for those who did research on indigenous areas for their master's or PhD dissertations. In the past, especially in the 80s, we have, in the Guatemalan case, a lot of scholars who came, did the research, and went into the university level and got their PhDs. But we don't know much about them. It's been 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Of course, some of them are connected. The majority, I will say, are not connected anymore because they are in the competitive war of the PhD in the US school system, and they are more involved with other issues, with other groups and teaching. We thought that by bringing those who actually know very well Latin American indigenous culture, if we could reach them and ask them how to work together. The academia component is very important because new students wanted to know more about Latin American indigenous cultures, and those who are working in the middle level, which are organizers like myself, could link the people who are in the bottom level, who actually are living, suffering, struggling. And we thought that we should create this network among indigenous, and we have some ideas about that. What happened in terms of the Nahual Foundation is that we became in 1987, just to have a reference in terms of something that click in our minds why to have a network among indigenous people is so important. The Catholic Church, the Latin American Catholic Church, handed a document among the indigenous communities in Latin America, all the bishops' conference, and as some people might know, the schisma that happens in 1960, 62 specifically, among or within the Catholic Church, it was called the Vatican II. The Vatican II started inside the Catholic Church to actually a call. It was a call and to review the pastoral practicing and why really the vernacular languages should be incorporated into the canon law in the Catholic Church institution, because those who were born before the 60s, they experienced and they had the experience of being in the Catholic Church by listening all the preachers, priests, nuns, participating in masses, being translated into the Latin language, and the Latin languages was the official language of the Catholic Church. But also, since this encounter of different cultures in Africa, encounters in the Asia countries and territories, and the encounters in Latin America, a lot of bishops and priests and all these movements who were changing the world around the world, they actually reflect on how important it is to talk in the language that the people talk, and they should change these languages and apply the values of Christianity into the culture that people are doing their practicing. And of course, this schisma in the Catholic Church came as a big gathering and a big conference between 1962 to 65. It was the Pope John the 23rd, and he actually was the one who allowed to missionaries to speak and to learn more the indigenous languages. That doesn't mean that until then the missionaries spoke their languages. Of course, there were a lot of missionaries, especially the Jesuits in Latin America, who since the 16th centuries learned how to speak the native languages of the culture and practicing and inculturate some of the practicing of the indigenous people inside their religious pastoral work. But officially the church were having their masses in Latin. When that thing changed in 1962 to 65, and the bishops of Latin America also had a big conference in Medellin, Colombia in 1968, when the first time happened where a pope left the Vatican to go to visit a different country. He came here to Medellin, Colombia, Latin America, and one of the statements of the bishops there was that it's very complicated in Latin America to talk about God, because unless the economy, the poverty, the injustice is resolved, God will come to the people. Otherwise, talking about God and preaching about God is going to be complicated, because how can you tell somebody who is hungry to think and to receive God in their hands when the hungry is part of the sin, the social sin that has to be resolved, and the church has to push to actually provide with efficiency and change that structure. And of course, that was created a big change among the Latin American church, and also liberation theology was implemented. some theologians were working among indigenous groups, and they were developing something which is called organic theology, which basically breaks completely the relationship with the Vatican, with the Roman Catholic Church, because it's just listening about the testimonies of the rituals and histories or storytellers from where people or some indigenous culture gets their values. And those theologians actually were working for a long time among indigenous communities, and they actually were reflecting on that. And they were more advanced than liberation theologists. They were more advanced, and they were pushing and they were pushing. And of course, that 10 years of liberation theology and reflection about the pastoral action of the Catholic Church was a key to combine more issues and rituals that comes directly from the indigenous tradition. In 1979, the same conference, the same gathering happens in Puebla, Mexico, actually to evaluate what happens with the last 10 years of the practicing, because what the Catholic Church as an institution experienced was a lot of priests left the orders, religious congregations, nuns decided not to continue among the Catholic institutions, and they started to join the revolutionary movements in Latin America. And there was more to be said if you actually accompany the people directly without being a religious leader or basically pastoral worker. You could do really the same work, not necessarily to be under the Catholic institution. But of course, it's not just the Catholic changes. It was also among the evangelical traditional churches that this movement were happening, especially in the United States, that Lutherans, Anglicans, and some Jewish communities were actually joining this practical work of preaching a new face of Jesus, not the Jesus that was massacred, or the Jesus that was tortured, or the Jesus that was destroyed by the poverty, by the hunger, by injustice, and liberate and trying to talk about a resurrected Jesus. It was a big challenge for these theologians and philosophy students. But in 1979, another event happened in Latin America. It was the Sandinista Revolution and the Grenade Revolution in Granada, in South America. And a lot of people in Nicaragua actually were very happy coming to Nicaragua to start this new liberation theology movement, where actually Christian community-based groups were the ones who actually joined the forces against the Somoza dictatorship. And that model, we know, that was labeled as a communist and typified that the Catholic Church is using with this liberation theology teachings, the Marxist analysis, economical Marxist, in order to interpret the realities of the poverty, the classes and ethnicities, and all these dynamics of plusvalia and oppression that was happening in Latin America. In any case, the indigenous situation, by 1987, the Catholic Church decided to hand it a document, because the Catholic Church wanted to know more about what the community or Christian community-based groups feel in terms of the 500 years of Christianization in Latin America. And that document, I remember I was then in the Santa Maria Chiquimula Totonicapán area, and we were basically reading the document, and that document were kind of suggesting to make the people to be happy about Christianity and to actually talk about the importance of Christianity after 500 years. But the people who were reflecting on this document, we started receiving some feedbacks from the communities, and people were kind of analyzing that the Catholic institutions were responsible for destroying indigenous traditional and religion and practicing. People were very sad that the Catholic institution and evangelical historical churches, Christianity in general, destroyed a lot of elements of the cultural significance matters in indigenous communities, and the memory in some communities were lost completely. And that year, 1987, it was a very hot year in terms of reflections in all Latin American indigenous groups, and a lot of initiatives were coming and trying to demonstrate this syncretism, or this way of being tied. Is not possible to go back and clear this combination of syncretism. Therefore, the church had to combine these practices. And I remember when I was in Panama in 1981 to 85, in both occasions, working with indigenous communities, it was the first initiative that happens among my friends who were working in the South American region to create the Via Yala, which in Kuna language means Nuestra Tierra, our land. It was an initiative to create a link, a network for indigenous people to gather information about indigenous and share these thoughts to others, to learn about what was going on. Well, when I was in Totonicapán and Santa Maria Chiquimula, my reflection on these things was that it was complicated to report good things to the Catholic institution because the indigenous were having their own reflection, no? And by 1988, the tension was very large and big, and I was very happy that being in Quetzaltenango, I was part of that team that was reflecting on the need of indigenous pastoral work, and we created that pastoral work among other people, and the Diocese of Quetzaltenango embraced that pastoral teaching, and now is working in Guatemala. But 1991, the tensions were more clear. People were divided among Latin American indigenous groups, and it was a movement that actually the movement was suggesting to have Monsignor Proaño from Ecuador to be the leader who was supporting all the indigenous causes in Ecuador and Latin America, and influenced the bishops in Latin America about talking about indigenous issues. And it was suggested that he could be or should be the Nobel Prize that year. But in 1992, we had in Guatemala the big gathering where 10,000 people, indigenous groups from Alaska, from Canada, from Mexico, Central America, and South America, came to the city of Quetzaltenango, Guatemala, and we had a big conference, and that conference was a big gathering of 10,000 indigenous representatives from different groups. And it was a big lesson. Out of that experience, actually, Rigoberta Menchú became the leader of that movement and was suggested to become the Nobel Prize. And we were very happy and very honored that Rigoberta Menchú actually took that step. And the Mayan tragedy and the Mayan resistance community were actually suffering a lot. The only way to know more about these circumstances of what was going on with the ethnocide in Guatemala was published after Rigoberta Menchú's testimony. And other leaders from Guatemala who were great leaders during the 80s, who actually were more known by talking more about the Guatemalan situation. That all of those experiences being in San Diego, and being in communication with my friends through letters, emails, phones, and continuously visiting, going and back and forth from the US to Central America for meetings and conferences, I kind of like the idea of establishing the foundation that could be the network for the indigenous peoples in the Americas. And we decided to put that together because I encountered some Native American professors and non-Native American professors in the archaeology department, anthropology department, history departments, political science departments in the US. And I was very happy to know that for 46 years, a lot of conferences in the US, in the Anthropology Association the American Anthropology Association, the Latin American Studies Association, the Western Sociological Association, all of these were having always issues among the Native Americans, the First Nations in Canada, and I became more or less to encounter wonderful professors and people who were working in the academia sector, and sharing with them. I told them about this idea in one of my conferences, or one of the conferences, that I wanted to share this experience to create a link and a network among the indigenous people, even though there were somehow some link and network among some groups from south to north. I think it's very important to establish some particular or focus in particular issues where we can advance the indigenous reality in class for students, and also for underdeveloped countries, and to actually know that, let them know that there are some people who care about them, of the future, and to raise their standards of poverty indicators. And that's the thing that we wanted to envision it. And we decided to create like a mission statement where the Nahual Foundations will seek through analysis and research to improve a strategy and policy and decision making for the indigenous people of the Americas. We wanted to advance the progressive organizing for social, economic, and environmental justice actions, and to sustain and support those organizers who actually are working and nurture the people who are advancing the indigenous cause in the Americas. We wanted to actually to create this website where you just click, and at least in the virtual reality you could have, like, in that box, all the indigenous groups where people can just click and learn more about those people. And we came with the idea about talking with other people who are experts on this technology war, and they are helping us to think and to bring ideas in the Guatemalan reality. Just to mention the linguistic community, they started to do research in 1949, and there is a well-documented bibliography from 1949 to 1990, almost 50 years of work from the different linguistic community, academics. They've been doing research on the Guatemalan languages, not just Guatemala. You can find ethnologue.com and you will find these wonderful tools, how the Summer Institute of Linguistics, the Linguistic Summer Institute, the way they were being founded in the 1800s. By 1920s, they were having already some publication in different indigenous languages. But of course, the linguistic community advanced, theoretically speaking, and they have to be open more a little bit about the new theories. And as in any group, they had their own divisions, and they had fights, theoretically speaking. Noam Chomsky came and kind of advanced some of the issues in terms of inculturating the languages and educate the people, the native languages, in order to actually create like academies, national academies, to officialize common language in order to work in a written form of the indigenous languages. And since 1949 to 1990, 50 years of work, the Guatemalan government in 1990 accepted officially 4 languages to be translated: the Maya Mam, the Maya Quiche, the Maya Cachiquel, and the Maya Quechí. By 1996, when the peace process came, the 22 languages were incorporated, and we are very happy that these things are happening. My friends in Oaxaca, the 2 linguistics who are working with the Mixtec Academy language, they are part of the Nahual Foundation team. They actually are advisors. They've been working for the past 22 years. In the Panama region, we have the team of Nahual Foundation, who actually the head of the national policies with indigenous, working for the government right now in Panama. He is actually one of our members. And then we have an Acuna tribe in islands in Panama, one of the wonderful sociologists, an indigenous Kuna, who actually is member of our think tank. And we have some groups like the Kumeyay indigenous band in San Diego, who are actually very open to listen to our experiences in the South, because the U.S. indigenous groups, they have a different history in the context of the people who invaded them, the French, the English people, and other European countries from the northern European regions. In our case, the Portuguese and the Spaniard were the ones who came and actually destroyed great of cultural issues. We actually wanted to create this think tank, thinking about 4 particular major forces or task forces that could be implemented. Like, one is working on emergency reactions task force, where indigenous people could be helped by a team of experts on any emergency situation. No? Like, for example, we saw the realities in the Ecuadorian realities with the oil companies, the mining companies, or the Bolivian companies, and no one knows anything about that other than what the press was releasing. But talking with the people really was very important. We have the North and South American Indigenous Network as a link, and working in alliances, the Cultural Survival Task Force and the Information and Communication Task Force, which could be, now that we see the CNN or Al Jazeera or CBS or BBC, all of these major media corporations who are working with the news, live news, we could actually do something similar with the indigenous people, just by having a satellite, put it there, and bring the news, being in a box in the computer, and virtually we could have access of what's going on with any or every cultural groups of indigenous in the Americas. The Nahual Foundation think tank by and for indigenous of the Americas, in the Guatemala branch, the Guatemala site, we incorporated our work among the indigenous communities in Zacatepeques, the Cachiquel area, but we also are beyond that, we decided to have some issue that could touch the national structure of Guatemala, and we decided to work with the community council development, which is a methodology used after the peace process in 1996 to get all the involvements of the different voices in the Guatemalan society. And we are working, doing trainings every Wednesdays in our office here in Antigua. We have this a center, a community center also, that provides some trainings and being close with some cultural issues, and we create those issues on events for people to understand what we are doing. We are covering Day of the Dead rituals and traditions, and helping the young kids who are doing these rite of passages by showing how to build kites. We do some workshops on building kites, quilting. We do some workshops on how to be a leader. Youth groups are also involved with this. We have 9 commissions. We are talking about the public health, and we address the environmental approaches in terms of this commission has the willingness to plant trees and do reforestation, which is something that we are involved with. We actually have a project on education. We have some wonderful models to teach the teaching at home. The teacher at home is one of the models that we are using by the Guatemalan Institute of Radio Long Distance Education. We actually have a wonderful ideas about the future, how the indigenous network within the Guatemalan groups could be incorporated and be part of the network that we already have in Oaxaca for the region of Mexico, in Panama for the region of South America, and we have the Guatemala side, which is this office for the Central American region, and we have the San Diego office, which is covering the network among the First Nation and the indigenous people in the U.S.